Imagine this. In the shadows of our modern world, a silent clock is ticking down to the greatest financial unraveling since the fall of empires. It's 2025, and the global economy teeters on a knife's edge, buried under a mountain of debt so colossal it defies comprehension. What if I told you this isn't random chaos, but a precise, repeating cycle that's wiped the slate clean 5 times in the last 2 millennia? Debts don't just vanish, they explode, leaving ordinary savers penniless and the powerful unscathed. And right now, we're hurtling toward that explosion. Buckle up, because I'm about to pull back the curtain on the hidden forces that could reset everything you know about money. Let's start with the cold, hard reality staring us in the face. Picture the world economy as a vast, interconnected web, trillions of dollars flowing like blood through its veins. But in 2025, that web is strangling itself. Global debt has ballooned to a staggering $300 trillion, dwarfing the planet's annual output of just $90 trillion. That's a debt to GDP ratio of 335%, a ratio that screams imbalance. In the United States, the epicenter of it all, the national debt alone clocks in at $36 trillion. Add in the personal burdens, $1.7 trillion in student loans chaining young dreamers to endless repayments, $1.6 trillion in auto loans fueling a illusion of mobility, $1.2 trillion on credit cards that promise instant gratification but deliver lifelong regret, and a whopping $11 trillion in corporate debt propping up hollowed-out industries. Governments, corporations, households, everyone's leveraged to the hilt. Leaders tout recovery and growth, but peel back the layers and you'll see the math doesn't add up. Interest payments alone devour more than the entire new wealth we create each year. This isn't sustainable. It's a house of cards built on borrowed time. But here's where it gets chilling. This isn't the first time humanity has danced on the edge of this abyss. History isn't a jumble of random events. It's a blueprint, etched in the ruins of civilizations that thought they were invincible. Over the past 2,000 years, 5 cataclysmic resets have erased debts on a scale that makes today's trillion-dollar fortunes seem trivial. These weren't gentle reforms, they were total annihilations, where savings evaporated, currencies crumbled, and wealth shifted like sand in a storm. And each one followed the same eerie 6-stage pattern, as predictable as the phases of the moon. We're not talking prophecy or speculation. This is pattern recognition, drawn from the blood and ink of the past. Understanding this pattern isn't just academic, it's your early warning system for the storm that's already brewing. To grasp why these resets happen, we have to dive into the mechanics of debt itself, the invisible chains binding our economy. Debt isn't just money owed. It's a promise extracted from the future. When you take out a loan for a house or a business borrows to expand, you're wagering that tomorrow's productivity will cover today's borrowing. Governments do the same on steroids, pledging trillions that future generations must somehow produce. But there's a breaking point, a mathematical red line where promises outstrip possibility. Imagine an economy growing at 3% a year. That's $2.7 trillion in fresh value from a $90 trillion base. Now layer on $300 trillion in debt at even a modest 3% interest. $9 trillion due annually in payments alone. The numbers clash like tectonic plates. The system grinds to a halt, trapped in a vicious loop where new borrowing only services the old. It's a Ponzi scheme masquerading as progress, and like all such schemes, it demands an endgame. When that endgame arrives, there's no escaping the math. Something has to break, either the debts or the entire economic order. Enter the debt jubilee. not some utopian handout, but a brutal necessity. A jubilee means the wholesale cancellation of debts, wiping out obligations across the board. Creditors see their claims evaporate. Debtors walk free, but the fallout is seismic. Banks collapse, markets freeze, and trust in the system shatters. Why does this happen? Because the alternative is paralysis, an economy choked by unpayable burdens, where every dollar earned funnels straight to interest rather than innovation or investment. History reveals only 3 paths to resolution, each more devastating than the last. First, hyperinflation. Central banks flood the world with printed money, inflating away the debt until it's paid back in worthless scraps. Savers watch their life's work dissolve into hyper-priced bread. Second, outright jubilee. Governments decree the slate clean, but at the cost of gutting the financial architecture, forcing a painful rebuild from the ashes. Third, war. The ultimate reset button, where bombs and battles destroy enough infrastructure and lives that debts become footnotes in the chaos. No negotiation, no fourth way. Reality enforces the equation when politicians' promises fail. Now let's trace this pattern through the ages, step by step, to see how it unfolds with metronomic precision. The 6 stages aren't abstract. They're the anatomy of collapse, repeating like a dark symphony. Stage 1, the illusion of prosperity through unchecked credit expansion. It always starts here, with the siren song of easy money. Lenders loosen the reins, borrowers flood in, and the economy hums with false vigor. Governments celebrate the, quote, underscore zero funding grand projects on borrowed fumes, but it's a mirage. Xiaofei pulled from tomorrow to paint today golden. Take ancient Rome, around 10 to 30 AD. The empire under Augustus was at its zenith, a colossus of marble and might. Credit markets ignited like wildfire. Patricians lent fortunes to plebeians starting farms, to merchants trading silks from the East, even to fellow elites chasing status. The Senate greenlit colossal public works, aqueducts snaking across hills, roads carving through wilderness, forums buzzing with commerce, all bankrolled by debt. Senators vied for extravagance, borrowing to stage lavish gladiatorial spectacles that thrilled the masses. Provincial governors dipped into credit to grease palms and secure their posts. Rome pulsed with activity. Grain silos overflowed. Legions marched on paved highways. Leaders hailed it as the golden age of productivity. But beneath the surface, the empire was hollowing out, borrowing against a future that couldn't deliver. This illusion doesn't last. We slide into stage 2. The debt spiral tightens as growth stalls and interest bites deeper. What seemed like fuel becomes a noose. Rome's expansion slowed, distant provinces rebelled, trade routes faltered under barbarian pressures. Loans compounded, interest rates crept up as lenders sensed the strain. The elite's opulence masked a creeping rot, farmers defaulting on lands pledged to patrician banks, public treasuries stretched thin by endless wars. Warnings from scribes and mathematicians echoed ignored. The math showed repayments outpacing the empire's harvest. By the 30s AD, Stage 3 gripped Rome. Denial and desperate measures. Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor, faced a credit crunch that threatened the core. Senators clamored for bailouts. The mob demanded bread amid rising prices. Tiberius pumped state funds into banks, but it was a bandage on a hemorrhage. Historians whisper of a secret decree in 33 AD, a veiled jubilee where debts were quietly erased through manipulated coinage and forced lendings. The reset came not with fanfare, but through hyperinflation's cousin, devalued currency and selective defaults that shattered savings. Patricians lost fortunes overnight. Plebeians gained a fleeting reprieve, but the empire's financial veins scarred over, paving the way for centuries of instability. Rome didn't fall that day, but the seed of its unraveling was sown in debt's erasure. Fast forward to medieval Europe in 1347, and the pattern re-emerges, darker and deadlier. Stage 1, replayed in the High Middle Ages commercial boom. Italian city-states like Venice and Florence blossomed on credit-fueled trade. Merchant banks lent to kings and popes, financing crusades and cathedrals. Wool guilds borrowed to expand. Nobles pawned estates for tournaments and finery. The economy soared, ships laden with spices, markets teeming with goods. Popes in Avignon blessed the growth as divine favor. But it was credit's honey trap, drawing Europe into Stage 2's snare. The Black Death loomed, but before the plague, debts mounted as overextension hit. Failed harvests, Viking raids disrupting trade, interest devouring feudal incomes. Stage 3 descended with the pestilence itself in 1347, a reset forged in unimaginable horror. The plague wasn't just biological, it was economic Armageddon. Populations halved, laborers scarcer, debts on manors and guilds became unenforceable amid the graves. Creditors, monasteries, Jewish lenders, Italian bankers saw claims dissolve as survivors repudiated loans in the chaos. Kings like Edward III of England defaulted on massive war debts to Italian houses, triggering bankruptcies from Genoa to London. It was war's grim sibling, mass death as the great eraser. Savings? What savings survived the Reaper were devalued in the frantic rebuild. Europe emerged feudalism's husk, birthing the Renaissance from debt's ashes, but at what cost? The rhythm accelerates in revolutionary France 1789. Stage 1, the Enlightenment's credit mania. Versailles glittered on borrowed opulence. Louis XVI's court borrowed from Dutch and Swiss bankers to fund wars and palaces, while peasants took loans for seed in a starving land. The economy, quote, won through speculation. Stocks in the Mississippi and South Sea echoes, philosophes praising progress. But Stage 2 crept in. American Revolution debts piled on ancient ones. Crop failures and taxes squeezed the vine growers and artisans. Interest payments consumed half the budget, forcing more borrowing just to breathe. Stage 3 ignited the powder keg. The Estates General's deadlock bred riots turning to guillotines. The National Assembly's reset was a jubilee by fire, confiscating church lands, repudiating royal debts, inflating assignats until they were confetti. Creditors, from Genevan bankers to Parisian merchants, were ruined. The old order's wealth transferred to revolutionaries and speculators. Hyperinflation peaked at 13,000%, savings incinerated in the terror's blaze. France reset, birthing a republic, but the pattern's echo reverberated through Napoleonic wars. Weimar Germany, 1923, brings the pattern to the industrial age. Stage 1, post-World War I, reparations-fueled borrowing masked the scars. Factories hummed on American loans via the Dawes Plan. Berlin cabarets pulsed with borrowed glamour. Hypermodern credit created a illusory roar. Radios, cars, jazz for the masses. Stage 2, the Great Depression's shadow. But earlier, hyper-reparations and occupation costs spiraled debts. Mark printing presses word to pay Versailles toll. Stage 3, total meltdown. Wheelbarrows of cash for bread, a loaf at 200 billion marks, hyperinflation as reset, debts paid in paper blizzards, wiping savers and bondholders. Industrialists like Krupp rose from the ruins, their loans inflated away while pensioners starved. The pattern precise. Prosperity's illusion to denial's fury. Finally, post-war Europe. 1953. Stage 1 in the 1930s buildup, Nazi credit expansion, autobahns and armaments on deficit spending, boom under Hitler, debts invested in conquest. Stage 2, war's toll, but prelude in mounting obligations. Stage 3, London's agreement, a veiled jubilee where Allied powers forgave half of Germany's external debts, erasing $15 billion in reparations echoes. War's destruction made the rest irrelevant. Marshall Plan rebuilt on a clean slate. Savings lost in the Blitz, wealth shifted to victors. These aren't isolated tales. They're rehearsals for Stage 4 onward. Stage 4, panic and contagion where defaults cascade like dominoes, freezing credit and sparking runs. Stage 5, interventions frenzy. Central banks intervene, but it only delays the inevitable, inflating the bubble further. Stage 6, the reset strikes. Hyperinflation, jubilee, or war, annihilating debts but torching the innocent. Why does this matter in 2025? We're locked in Stage 3. Denial reigns. Central banks slash rates, pump trillions in QE, promising endless growth. But the math mocks them. $300 trillion demanding $9 trillion yearly against $2.7 trillion produced. Student debtors riot in whispers. Corporations zombie walk on cheap credit. Governments kick the can with deficits. The illusion cracks daily. Crypto crashes, real estate wobbles, inflation nips at heels. History's metronome ticks to Stage 4. A spark, a bank failure, a trade war, a cyber collapse, and contagion spreads. Your dollar, your 401k, your mortgage, all at risk. Assets like stocks may soar in the panic, but when the reset hits, gold glints. Real estate resets to survival value and cash burns. This isn't fear-mongering, it's foresight. The powerful know, billionaires hoard hard assets, nations stockpile gold. But you, awareness is your shield. Diversify beyond fiat illusions, question the promises, prepare for the wipe. History's resets didn't spare the unaware, they rewarded the vigilant. As we stand in 2025's fragile dawn, remember, debt's empire always falls, but from its ruins, new worlds rise. The question isn't if, but how and when you'll be ready. Imagine this, a glittering empire on the brink, where rivers of gold flow not from mines but from promises. Debts piled upon debts, fueling palaces and parades, until the whole facade cracks like thunder in a clear sky. What if I told you that the global economy in 2025 is hurtling toward the same invisible cliff our ancestors tumbled over time and again? I've spent years unraveling these forgotten threads of financial folly, and what they reveal is chilling. Every boom built on borrowed time ends in a bust that reshapes the world. Let's pull back the curtain on ancient Rome, where that seemingly unstoppable engine of expansion was already sputtering under its own weight. Picture the eternal city in the early days of the empire. Marble forums rising like monuments to ambition, spice routes buzzing with ships heavy from distant provinces. Trade swelled, luxuries cascaded into the markets. Silks from the east, wines from Gaul, exotic beasts for the arena. It felt like prosperity incarnate, a golden age scripted by the gods themselves. But as I sifted through the dusty scrolls and inscriptions, a darker truth emerged. This wasn't growth born of ingenuity or fertile fields. It was a mirage conjured by credit. The aqueducts and amphitheaters, those awe-inspiring feats, didn't till new soil or forge stronger tools. They just kept the masses fed and entertained, the elite draped in false grandeur. Senators, those toga-clad power brokers, dove headfirst into this debt spiral. They'd borrow fortunes to stage ever grander spectacles, gladiators clashing under the Colosseum's shadow, chariots thundering to the roar of 50,000 voices. It was bread and circuses on steroids, a velvet glove over the iron fist of economic fragility. By the reign of Augustus, around 20 AD, the rot had set in deep. Patrician families, once landowners of vast estates, were hawking their legacies just to keep up appearances. Silk banquets for guests who whispered of their insolvency. Creditors lurked in the shadows, senators' ledgers bloated with loans that rolled over like waves, each one bigger than the last. As long as fresh coin trickled from the temple's vaults, the party raged on. But illusions, I've learned, have a shelf life, and Rome's was expiring. Fast forward now to the misty fields of medieval Europe, from 1300 to 1340, where the echoes of Rome's folly rang out in a new key. The High Middle Ages had just crested an agricultural wave, plows turning black earth into bountiful harvests, villages swelling into towns. Credit, that sly serpent, slithered into the picture, peddled by Italian merchant bankers like the Bardi and Peruzzi families. These weren't dusty moneylenders, they were the venture capitalists of their day, funneling gold to kings, counts, and even the Pope's coffers. Monarchs snatched it up like forbidden fruit, especially for the endless dance of war. Take the 100 Years' War, that brutal chess match between England and France. Edward III, the warrior king with a crown heavier than his ambitions, tapped Italian lenders for over 1.5 million florins, hundreds of billions in today's dollars. It bankrolled longbows and sieges, turning battlefields into abattoirs of ambition. On the surface, Europe bloomed. Mediterranean trade routes hummed with wool and spices. Gothic cathedrals pierced the heavens like stone prayers, and fledgling universities in Oxford and Bologna sparked the first flickers of Renaissance thought. Artisans hammered away, merchants haggled in bustling ports. It screamed progress. Yet, as I traced the ledgers from Florence's archives, the underbelly snarled back. Kings weren't investing in plows or ports, they were borrowing to settle old scores, then borrowing more to pay the interest. The bankers, overextended like tightrope walkers in a gale, had chained their fortunes to thrones that teetered on default. Prosperity? It was a house of vellum, fragile and flammable. This pattern, this seductive cycle, didn't fade with the fall of empires. It mutated, rearing its head in the salons of revolutionary France between 1700 and 1785. After Louis XIV's endless campaigns, the Sun King's wars that scorched Europe from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, the treasury was a gaping wound. But austerity? That bitter pill stayed unswallowed. His heirs, Louis XV and then the ill-fated the 16th, doubled down, borrowing to chase glory in Austria, Poland, and the cataclysmic 7 Years' War. By the time young Louis XVI ascended, interest alone devoured half the kingdom's revenue, a vampire feasting on the nation's veins. Yet Versailles glittered on, a bubble of Baroque excess. Paris, Europe's beating heart of culture, overflowed with philosophers debating enlightenment in candlelit cafes, while nobles swirled through masked balls in powdered wigs and powdered fortunes. The court threw feasts that could bankrupt barons, fireworks painting the night sky over manicured gardens. Creditors, from Dutch syndicates to Genoese houses, kept the spigot open, mesmerized by France's aura as the continent's richest power. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore for, underscore, underscore. The lenders murmured, ignoring the whispers of empty granaries and seething peasants. It was the ultimate high-wire act, opulence masking oblivion, debt dressed as destiny. But destiny, as history whispers to those who listen, has a way of collecting its due. Now let's pivot to the smoke-choked ruins of post-World War I Germany, 1918 to 1921, where the stakes turned apocalyptic. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a peace accord, it was a financial guillotine, demanding 132 billion gold marks in reparations, and some so colossal it mocked Germany's shattered industry. The Weimar Republic, that fragile democracy born in defeat, turned to the only lifeline it knew: domestic borrowing. Print money, they said, to foot the bills, rebuild factories, and dodge the tax hikes that could ignite revolution. At first, it worked like a charm. Factories hummed back to life in the Ruhr Valley, unemployment lines shortened, bread returned to tables. Cabarets in Berlin pulsed with jazz and defiance, a fleeting jazz age amid the rubble. Investors poured in, betting on the rebound. But peel back the propaganda posters and you'll find the truth I uncovered in yellowed Reichsbank records. This was no resurrection. It was resurrection on credit, phantom funds claiming tomorrow's output in a country too broken to deliver. The marks flooding the streets weren't backed by steel or grain. They were "I owe us" stacking to the sky, a prelude to the hyperinflation nightmare that would soon devour the mark and the middle class alike. Borrowing felt like breathing life into the corpse, but it was just delaying the autopsy. And then the grandest illusion of them all, the post-World War II Western world from 1950 to 1980. Emerging from the ashes of global carnage, leaders scripted what seemed like a perpetual springtime. In the U.S., the GI Bill unleashed a torrent of subsidized loans, homes for heroes in leafy suburbs, college for the masses, startups sprouting like weeds after rain. Across the Atlantic, the Marshall Plan pumped billions in aid, much of it as low-interest credit, resurrecting Europe's smokestacks and auto bonds. Governments borrowed at whisper-thin rates, riding a wave of growth that clocked double digits in places, inflation tames, living standards rocketing upward. Washing machines whirred in every kitchen, jets shrank the skies, and the American dream exported itself worldwide. It was intoxicating, the greatest credit binge history had ever seen. Economies expanded faster than empires once conquered lands. But here's the revelation that kept me up nights piecing together IMF archives and congressional testimonies. This wasn't sustainable alchemy. It was stage one of the Great Debt Deception, the expansion phase where borrowing masquerades as brilliance. Low rates lure you in, growth gilds the lily, and everyone from factory floors to boardrooms believes the party never ends. Yet every ledger I've audited screams the same warning. Stage one inevitably births stage two. What is stage two? It's the tipping point, the moment debt eclipses 250% of GDP, that invisible red line economists now map like cartographers charting fault lines. Cross it, and the ground shifts. Resources once funneled into factories and farms get siphoned into interest payments, starving innovation. Growth stutters, then stalls. I've seen it in models from Reinhardt and Rogoff's toilsome tomes. Once total debt, public, private, corporate, swells beyond that threshold. Each extra dollar borrowed yields less than a dime in output. It's like revving an engine until the piston seize. Flashback to Rome in the early 30s AD, under the watchful eye of Emperor Tiberius. The city's veins were clogged with debt, senators drowning in millions of sesterces, merchants folding under loan burdens, even the mightiest houses technically bankrupt. No GDP stats back then, but the historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, paint a vivid hell. Foreclosures rippling through the forum, suicides in senatorial villas. The leverage had outstripped the empire's ability to extract taxes from provinces stretched thin by rebellion and drought. In medieval Europe, by 1340 to 1345, the dam burst. Edward III's England owed Italian banks more than a year's royal income. France mirrored the madness. The Bardi and Peruzzi, those titans of Tuscan finance, faced defaults dwarfing their reserves tenfold. Credit evaporated overnight, lending halted, rates rocketed, kings who once dined on borrowed largesse begged in vain. The Black Death would soon compound the chaos, but the financial freeze was the spark. France's reckoning hit hard from 1780 to 1788. Debt gobbled 60% of revenue and interest, totaling perhaps 3,000% of the government's take, implying a staggering load relative to the era's modest GDP. Creditors balked, rates surged, and the vicious loop tightened. More borrowing needed just to service the old, until the Bastille's stones echoed with the fury of a starved populace. The revolution wasn't born of guillotines alone, it was forged in the forges of unpaid debts. So why does this matter now in 2025 as I record this from a world teetering on its own ledge? Global debt has shattered that 250% barrier. Households maxed on mortgages, corporations leveraged to the hilt, governments drowning in trillions from pandemic bailouts and green transitions. We're in stage 2, folks. Growth anemic, inflation flickering like a faulty bulb, central banks trapped in a maze of their own making, China's property bubble, America's student loans, Europe's sovereign strains. They're not isolated tremors. They're aftershocks of the same ancient quake. I've chased these ghosts across centuries, from Roman ruins to digital spreadsheets, and the lesson burns clear. Debt isn't a tool, it's a trap door. We borrow tomorrow to live today, but when the bill arrives, it's not just ledgers that shatter, societies do. The question isn't if we'll fall, it's how we climb out before the ground gives way. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and right now, the verse is ominous. What will you do when the music stops? Imagine this. It's 2025, and the global economy teeters on the edge of a chasm we've dug ourselves. Trillions in debt piling up like storm clouds, ready to unleash a financial deluge that could drown entire nations. But here's the hidden warning no one's shouting from the rooftops. We're not just borrowing from the future anymore. We're mortgaging it entirely, and the interest alone is devouring every scrap of progress we make. What if I told you this isn't some distant catastrophe? It's unfolding right now, echoing the ghosts of empires that rose and fell in flames of unpaid bills? Buckle up, because we're diving into the anatomy of a debt apocalypse, stage by stage, and by the end, you'll see why our world is one rate hike away from unraveling. Let's pull back the curtain on the first whispers of trouble. Where borrowing spirals out of control and the economy starts buckling under its own weight. Picture early 20th century Germany, a nation scarred by war, staggering under reparations that felt like chains forged in Versailles. By 1921, their total obligations, domestic loans tangled with those crushing war payments, had ballooned to over 400% of their gross output. We're talking 132 billion gold marks in reparations alone, while the country's yearly production hovered around a measly 30 billion. Impossible? Absolutely. Yet the government, desperate to keep the lights on, turned to their central bank, the Reichsbank, for endless loans just to scrape by. The debt wasn't just growing, it was metastasizing, outpacing any hope of economic recovery. This was the ignition point, the shift from manageable burdens to a runaway freight train. Fast forward to our own era, and the parallels hit like a gut punch. The 2008 crash, that seismic shock wave from Wall Street's greed-fueled implosion, didn't teach us restraint. Global debt, already at 200% of GDP, surged to 250% by 2010 as governments and corporations doubled down, injecting trillions to paper over the cracks. Deleveraging? A pipe dream. Instead, we accelerated, hitting 320% by 2020, right before the pandemic slammed the brakes on everything. Then came the floodgates. $17 trillion in emergency cash printed worldwide, propping up lockdowns and lost jobs. By 2022, we'd crossed into uncharted territory at 350% of global GDP, and the U.S., our federal tab alone, is 120% of output, with corporations at 45%, households drowning in 75%, and the financial sector adding another 80%, over 320% total. We're not skirting the edge of stage 2 anymore. We're deep in its grip, borrowing faster than we can dream up excuses. But here's where the intrigue thickens. The hidden mechanics of this beast, the way central banks become unwitting accomplices in the frenzy. In that Weimar nightmare of the early 20s, the Reichsbank wasn't just lending, it was fueling a monster. Every payment on reparations or domestic bonds required fresh cash, but the economy couldn't keep up. Debt compounded like interest on a bad bet, pulling resources from factories, farms, and families into the black hole of repayment. It's the same script today, but globalized. Post-2008, quantitative easing turned central banks into money printers extraordinaire, flooding markets with liquidity to keep the debt engine humming. Corporations issued bonds like candy, households racked up credit cards, and governments ran deficits that make Versailles look like pocket change. The result? A web of obligations so intertwined that pulling one thread risks the whole tapestry. Now let's escalate the stakes, because stage 3 isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's the suffocating reality where interest devours growth, locking us in a trap from which escape seems impossible. This is the math of doom, when the cost of servicing old debts eats every dollar of new economic expansion. You're not growing. You're treading water in quicksand. Any fresh borrowing only digs the hole deeper. Rewind to ancient Rome in 33 AD, a colossus built on conquest now crumbling under its loans. Creditors, those shadowy patricians holding the purse strings, demanded their due. Debtors, farmers, merchants, even senators, couldn't deliver. The credit markets froze solid. No new funds flowed for trade or land. Prices for property tanked as buyers vanished, and the empire's output funneled straight into interest vaults. Wealth shifted from the many to the few, but even that couldn't stem the bleed. The productive heart of Rome was starving, squeezed dry by yesterday's promises. Jump to 1345 in medieval Europe, and the pattern repeats with brutal clarity. King Edward III of England, fresh from battles that drained the treasury, defaulted on massive loans from Italian powerhouses like the Bardi and Peruzzi banks. He'd borrowed more than their entire capital, reckless ambition at its finest. When payments stopped, those banks didn't just stumble, they shattered. The Bardi crumbled first, dragging Peruzzi down in a domino cascade. Credit evaporated across the continent. Without those Florentine financiers, international trade ground to a halt. Kingdoms already strained saw their revenues vanish into interest black holes. Growth? Non-existent. It was a medieval debt trap where the weight of old wars choked the promise of new commerce. And France in 1788? That's the powder keg that lit the revolution. Over 60% of the royal budget vanished into interest. Not swords, not roads, but the endless echo of prior extravagance. Louis XVI was borrowing just to cover the interest tab, a classic Ponzi pyramid teetering on noble disdain. He summoned the assembly of notables, begging for tax hikes to bail out the crown. But the aristocracy, smelling rot in the monarchy's core, flat out refused. Forcing the issue? That sparked the fury leading to guillotines and a new republic born in blood. The lesson: when interest consumes your future, the system's fragility invites chaos. Back to Weimar, 1922 to 1923, and the escalation turns nightmarish. Reparations, domestic interest, and rebuilding costs swallowed the government's income whole. The only escape? Fire up the printing presses. The Reichsbank ran them non-stop, birthing hyperinflation that started as a whisper and roared into a scream. Prices doubled, then quadrupled, wiping out savings in a blink. Yet the debts, pegged to unyielding gold marks, swelled in real value even as paper currency turned to confetti. It was Stage 3 incarnate. Growth not just stalled, but inverted into destruction. Today, in 2025, we're staring down the same barrel. The U.S. shells out nearly $900 billion yearly on interest, eclipsing our defense spending, barreling toward $1 trillion even at these _quote_5___ rates. If they climb to historical norms, we're talking $1.5 trillion. Meanwhile, real GDP inches up $500 to $700 billion annually. Do the math? Interest is gobbling 100%, plus some, of our growth. Every hard-earned dollar of progress funnels back to bondholders, leaving nothing for innovation, infrastructure, or the average family. This isn't abstract, it's the debt trap snapping shut around us. Globally, as rates tick up amid inflation fights, emerging markets from Argentina to Turkey teeter, their interest burdens exploding. We're in Stage 3, folks, and the air is getting thin. Why does this matter now, in this precarious 2025? Because the traps of history aren't relics, they're blueprints. Post-pandemic recovery was supposed to be our deleveraging moment, but instead, we supercharged the cycle with stimulus that masked the rot. Central banks, once heroes of 2008, now grapple with inflation born of their own excess. Geopolitical storms, wars in Europe, tensions in Asia, pile on borrowing needs while climate disasters demand trillions more. And the math? It's screaming. With global debt at 350% of GDP and rising, even a mild recession could trigger defaults rippling like aftershocks. Investors are jittery. Bond yields creep higher, accelerating the squeeze. For you and me, it means higher costs, squeezed wages, and a future where governments cut corners on everything from healthcare to education to keep the lenders at bay. This isn't hyperbole. It's the hidden fault line under our financial system, ready to quake. Finally, Stage 4, the brutal awakening, when the numbers refuse to lie any longer. It's not about unwillingness to pay, it's mathematical impossibility. Creditors panic, demanding collateral. Debtors buckle, sparking defaults that crack the foundation. In Rome, 33 AD, the facade shattered. Emperor Tiberius's desperate edict, forcing creditors to plow 2/3 of their holdings into Italian real estate, aimed to buoy collapsing land values. Futile. Lending halted. Prosecutions jammed prisons with insolvent elites. Even patrician senators emerged bankrupt, their fortunes illusory. The empire's debt was unpayable, period. A revelation that exposed the rot at Rome's core. Medieval Europe, 1347, saw the aftershocks of those 1345 bank collapses. Kings scrambled for restructurings, shaving terms on loans in a bid to salvage liquidity. But trust was shattered. Credit lines dried up. Trade routes ghosted. The Black Death only amplified the horror, but the debt math had already decreed stagnation. Defaults spread like plague, kingdoms left scavenging for scraps. Weimar's 1923 climax, hyperinflation's fury, rendered debt surreal, but the real trap was the recognition. No amount of printing could outrun the gold-backed obligations. The mark's value plummeted to insanity. $1 bought billions, yet the burden grew, culminating in social upheaval and the Weimar Republic's fragility, paving the road to darker times. In our 2025 reality, Stage 4 looms larger with every rate decision. U.S. Treasuries, once the world's safe haven, face scrutiny as deficits balloon. China grapples with local government debts hidden in shadows. Europe wrestles zombie corporations propped by cheap money. When the math hits, projections showing interest surpassing all discretionary spending, the demands will mount. Creditors, from pension funds to sovereign wealth giants, will call in favors. Defaults could cascade. A major emerging market folds, dragging banks, then contagion hits the West. It's not if, but when the illusion breaks. So, as we stand here in 2025, gazing at this towering pyramid of promises, what reflection stares back? History whispers a dire truth. Debt traps aren't conquered by denial or more borrowing. They're dismantled by courage, restructuring, taxing the untaxed, investing in real growth over financial wizardry. We've danced on the edge before, from Rome's ruins to France's fires, and emerged transformed, sometimes scarred but wiser. The question for us? Will we recognize the trap before it springs, or let the math dictate our downfall? The global economy hangs in the balance. Your savings, your job, your future. It's time to wake up before the presses run out of ink and the lights go out. Imagine this. It's 2025, and the global economy teeters on the edge of a chasm deeper than any we've known. Trillions in debt, $300 trillion to be exact, hang like a guillotine over nations, corporations, and everyday families. The numbers scream impossibility, yet the system chugs on, fueled by denial and digital illusions. But what if I told you this isn't new? What if the whispers of collapse echoing through history books are now roaring in our headlines? We're not just repeating the past, we're accelerating toward its most explosive turning point. Buckle up, I'm about to uncover how unpayable debts have always ignited revolutions, plagues of chaos, and the birth of monsters. And right now, in our interconnected world, the fuse is lit. Let's pull back the curtain on the situation that's been brewing for centuries, starting with a king who gambled his realm and lost. Picture England in the 14th century, a land of castles and conquest under Edward III. He was a warrior king, ambitious and ruthless, borrowing vast sums from Italian moneylenders in Florence to fund endless wars against France. The loans piled up like storm clouds. 900,000 gold florins, a fortune that dwarfed the kingdom's annual income of just £100,000. Partial repayments? They trickled in like rain on parched earth. Extended deadlines? They stretched into oblivion. Collateral in the form of wool shipments and crown jewels. It was all smoke and mirrors. The brutal truth hit like a thunderclap. Even if Edward diverted every penny of revenue for over a decade, the debt would mock him from the grave. Whispers turned to shouts across Europe. Creditors, those Florentine bankers, began scribbling zeros on their ledgers, accepting the write-offs because denial was the only currency left. The elite were hollowed out, their empires built on borrowed time. This wasn't just bankruptcy. It was the first fracture in the medieval financial spine. But history doesn't pause for one kingdom's folly. It metastasizes. Fast forward to the opulent halls of Versailles in 1789, where France's glittering facade hid a rotting core. The monarchy's debts had ballooned from endless wars, lavish courts, and failed harvest, swallowing every sou of tax revenue just to service the interest, let alone run the government. The figures were laid bare in public ledgers, impossible to ignore. Imagine slashing the army to skeletons, halting every bridge and palace project. dismissing clerks and soldiers en masse. Still, the shortfall yawned wider than the scene. Jacques Necker, the sharp-eyed finance minister, thrust these ledgers into the light, hoping to spur tax hikes on the untouchable nobility. Instead, it was a spark in dry tinder. The numbers proved insolvency beyond salvation. The Third Estate, the vast underclass of farmers, artisans, and merchants, rose in fury, clamoring for outright default. Why bleed for debts racked up by kings on foreign battlefields? The aristocracy, those velvet-clad creditors holding the bonds, dug in their heels. They were the winners in this rigged game, their wealth tied to the chains binding the poor. The air thickened with tension, the streets simmering toward the storm that would topple thrones. Now let's peel back the hidden mechanisms driving these crises, the alchemy of money that turns prosperity into peril. In every era, debts start as tools of power. Kings borrow to conquer, empires expand on credit, but interest compounds like a silent predator, outpacing growth until the debtor nations are trapped in a mathematical vice. Gold-backed loans in medieval times demanded real treasure from illusory riches. In France, the debt wasn't just numbers. It was a web of privileges where nobles lent to the crown and shielded themselves from the taxman's reach. And in the ashes of World War I, Weimar Germany in 1923 became a laboratory of despair. The Treaty of Versailles had shackled the nation with reparations denominated in unyielding gold marks, billions upon billions, while hyperinflation turned paper currency to confetti. By summer, printing presses churned out trillions daily. A simple bread loaf spiraled to billions, forcing workers to dash to markets twice a shift before wages evaporated. Yet those reparations, still payable in gold, untouched by the fiat frenzy. Germany would need to mine value from thin air, more than its entire shattered economy could produce, just for the interest. Creditors from Paris and London knew the absurdity. Debtors in Berlin felt the noose. It was a system designed to strangle, revealing the cold calculus. When debt outstrips a society's productive soul, enforcement becomes a farce. Escalating the stakes, these unpayable burdens don't fade. They fracture societies. In Weimar's fevered streets, the realization dawned like a fever dream. The public eye, once blind to ledgers, now saw the emperor naked. Political arsonists fanned the flames, communists preaching wealth seizure, nationalists vowing to burn the debt treaties. Adolf Hitler's beer hall putsch in November 23 wasn't born in a vacuum. It was a desperate bid fueled by that very rage, promising to repudiate the reparations and reclaim German destiny. Strikes paralyzed factories. Wheelbarrows of cash bought groceries that spoiled before dinner. The implications rippled outward. Currencies collapse, savings vanish, and the social glue dissolves into tribal fury. Back in ancient Rome, around 33 AD, we'd see the same script play out with plebeian fury. Debtor prisons bulged like overripe fruit, families auctioned into bondage for scraps of silver. The tribunes, voices of the masses, stormed the Senate demanding a jubilee, a clean slate on all loans. Patricians, the patrician lenders whose vaults brimmed with "I owe us," balked. Cancel the debts? That meant erasing their fortunes. Deadlock bred riots. Mobs torched creditor villas under moonlit skies. The pressure cooker hissed, building toward the explosions that reshaped republics into empires. And then, the wild card of fate. Sometimes nature or calamity intervenes, as in medieval Europe from 1347 to 1350. The Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses had crumbled 2 years prior, leaving kings and nobles entangled in defaulted webs. Debtors clamored for absolution. Merchants claiming vanished banks took their obligations with them, barons defying crowns mired in their own mud. But the Black Death descended like divine judgment, scything through 30 to 50% of the continent in mere years. Creditors perished alongside borrowers. Ledgers burned in plague pyres. Labor vanished, wages rocketed, and enforcement, a ghost in the wind. The pandemic didn't just reset the debt, it obliterated the world that birthed it, merging political pressure with apocalyptic release. Why does this matter now in 2025? Because we're staring down the barrel of stage 4, the recognition. Armchair economists, quants in high rises, anyone punching numbers into a spreadsheet, they all see it. The U.S. national debt alone demands trillion-dollar surpluses annually for 36 straight years to chip away at principal, all while servicing another trillion in interest. That means jacking taxes by half or slashing spending by 70%. Political poison in an election-obsessed era. Globally, $300 trillion in liabilities equals 3 years of total output just to repay, leaving nothing for innovation, welfare, or survival. Central banks pump liquidity like morphine, but the patient is coding. We're not in hyperinflation yet, not riots in the streets, but the math is merciless. Crypto hedges and AI booms mask the rot, yet bonds wobble, yields spike, and whispers of _quote_6 echo in Davos corridors. This isn't hyperbole, it's arithmetic. We've restructured, extended, collateralized, just like Edward's wool pledges, but the end game looms. As Stage 5 ignites, political pressure for reset mounts like a gathering storm. Debtors, nations like the U.S., households drowning in mortgages, will demand jubilees, haircuts, or outright forgiveness. Creditors, pension funds, sovereign wealth giants, the ultra-wealthy, will claw for safeguards, firewalls against the wipeout. Governments, puppets in the middle, face the impossible. Honor the debts and spark uprising, or renege and shatter trust. The social contract phrase, trust in institutions, erodes. Populists surge with promises of reckoning. Look to France's revolution. The Third Estate's 98% versus the aristocratic 1%. Debts as the match that lit the powder keg. Or Germany's 1923 maelstrom, where repudiation fever birthed extremists who promised order through fire. We're not immune. In 2025's polarized gridlock, from Washington to Brasilia, the debtors' chorus grows louder. Will it be velvet revolution, digital currencies as the new gold standard, or something bloodier, shadowed by pandemics or cyber black swans? In the end, as I stand here gazing at our fragile 2025 horizon, one truth pierces the fog. Unpayable debt isn't just an economic riddle, it's the forge of history's fiercest upheavals. From Rome's riots to France's guillotines, Weimar's wheelbarrows to the plague's grim mercy, every era teaches the same lesson. Systems built on illusion crumble under scrutiny, birthing new orders from the rubble. We can delay with clever accounting, but recognition demands action. The question isn't if the reset comes, it's how, and at what cost. Will we learn from the ghosts, engineering a controlled burn, or let the pressure build until it explodes, reshaping our world in ways we can't yet fathom? The numbers don't lie. The choice before us now is ours. Imagine this. It's 2025, and the global economy teeters on the edge of a chasm deeper than the Great Depression. Debts, trillions in student loans, mortgages, corporate bonds, and sovereign IOUs pile up like storm clouds ready to unleash a financial deluge. I've been digging into the shadows of history, and what I uncover chills me. Every empire, every nation that reached this breaking point didn't just pay the piper. They shattered the flute entirely. Hyperinflation, plagues, wars, or forced resets. Debts don't vanish through polite negotiation, they explode, wiping out fortunes and forcing the world to start over. And right now, in our hyper-connected 2025 reality, the warning signs are flashing red. Are we sleepwalking into the same trap? Let me take you back, but not to dusty textbooks, to the raw, pulse-pounding moments when governments cracked under the weight of impossible promises. We're building on the chaos of 1923 Weimar Germany, where workers rioted in the streets, communists and Nazis whispered sweet nothings about debt cancellation, and Hitler himself tried to storm the gates with his beer hall putsch, all fueled by the refusal to bow to reparations. The political vice was tightening, squeezing the life out of a fragile republic. But that was just the spark. The real inferno? When the government realized it couldn't juggle those crushing debts and keep the homeland from unraveling. Picture Berlin's halls of power in late 1923. Officials poring over ledgers that screamed bankruptcy, while outside, the air crackled with unrest. They couldn't print enough marks to cover the holes without igniting a firestorm. Something had to break. Order, currency, or the entire system. Fast forward to today, 2025, and the echoes are deafening. Across the globe, from Wall Street to the souks of developing nations, voices on the left howl that loans are shackles forged by predatory lenders, exploiting the vulnerable while the elite hoard the gains. They demand jubilees, forgive student debts that chain millennials to servitude, pause mortgages strangling families, restructure corporate empires bloated on cheap credit, and grant sovereign breathers to countries drowning in IMF nooses. The right? They're no less furious, branding inflation as outright theft by central banks who've diluted our dollars into confetti, pulverizing savers' nests eggs in the name of _7__, both flanks are marching on the capitals, forcing politicians to scramble, unveiling student loan pardons, ballooning unemployment nets, and direct cash drops that slyly ease the debt burden through backdoor handouts. But here's the intrigue. These Band-Aids aren't stemming the bleed. The pressure cooker is hissing louder, steam building toward stage 5, what I call the prelude to collapse. We're witnessing it now in 2025's volatile markets, where crypto hedges flicker like desperate lifelines and gold prices spike on whispers of unrest. The endgame, stage 6, looms like a shadow, a total reset. Not through boring repayments, but destruction. Hyperinflation that turns wealth to ash, a biblical jubilee decreed from on high, or the thunder of war that buries debts in rubble. Creditors evaporate, savers watch lifetimes dissolve, and society rebuilds from the wreckage, forever scarred. I've chased these patterns through time and they never lie. Let's peel back the layers, starting with the ancients, to see how the mighty fell and why we're next in line. Our story begins in the opulent sprawl of ancient Rome, 33 AD, under Emperor Tiberius, a man haunted by visions of fiscal doom. The empire was a powder keg. Moneylenders had squeezed every drop from borrowers, sparking riots that threatened the eternal city's foundations. Private debts ballooned, mirroring our 2025 credit card crises, and the Senate buzzed with panic. Tiberius, ever the strategist, didn't let it fester. He dipped into the imperial coffers, unleashing a staggering 100 million sesterces in interest-free loans to desperate debtors, repayable over 3 years. It was a masterstroke on the surface. Borrowers settled their tabs with the emperor's gold, shifting the burden squarely onto the state. Private ledgers cleared, but at what cost? The treasury hemorrhaged, a temporary salve on a gangrenous wound. Yet suspense builds here. Relief was fleeting. Within decades, those debts metastasized again, forcing successors to wield a darker tool, currency debasement. Roman emperors, facing the same bind as our Fed chairs today, shaved silver from the denarius coin. By 200 AD, it was half precious metal. By 300 AD, a mere trace, under 5%. This wasn't mere tinkering. It was inflation by stealth, eroding debts in a tide of worthless coinage. Creditors clutched purses of fool's silver, repaid in currency that bought shadows, not sustenance. Method 1, in our grim playbook, inflated away, debased the dream, and watched the old order crumble as the empire staggered toward its twilight. Transition to the fog-shrouded fields of medieval Europe, 1347 to 1350, an era when death itself became the great equalizer. The Black Death wasn't just a plague, it was apocalypse on horseback, claiming 30 to 50% of the continent's souls in a merciless sweep. Debts? They were footnotes in the ledger of survival. Lords enforced serfdom with iron bonds of obligation, much like today's wage slaves trapped in gig economies. But as bodies piled in the streets, creditors perished alongside debtors, leaving estates to rot and contracts unenforceable. Survivors emerged into a world remade. Labor vanished, driving wages skyward as the desperate sought hands to till the soil. Feudal chains snapped. Serfs fled manors, debts dissolving in the chaos of empty villages. By 1350, the obligations of 1347 were ghosts, canceled not by decree, but by the scythe of catastrophe. Method 3, utter devastation, renders debts moot, birthing a new world from the pyres. Chilling, isn't it? In our 2025, with pandemic's scars still fresh and climate tremors rumbling, could nature or our own follies deliver a similar reckoning? Now escalate the drama to the guillotine's shadow in revolutionary France 1789 to 1794, where ideals clashed with economics in a blood-soaked frenzy. The monarchy's vaults were barren, debts from endless wars piling like storm debris. The National Assembly, fueled by revolutionary fire, seized the church's vast lands, 10% of France's terrain, and minted assignats, paper promises backed by holy soil. At dawn, it gleamed. Creditors cashed in, government obligations settled with land-pledged bills. The machine hummed, but greed or desperation twisted the valve. They printed furiously, flooding the realm until 1792's assignats dwarfed their collateral. Inflation roared to life, prices doubling, then exploding fourfold. By 1794, these notes were confetti. A gold louis, once 20 assignats, commanded 3,000. Hyperinflation's jaws snapped shut. Lenders to the crown were beggared, their fortunes vaporized in worthless script. Method 1, redux, debts paid, but with illusions that fueled the terror. As Paris burned, the lesson etched in stone: print too much, and the revolution devours its children. Weimar's nightmare in 1923? It's the hyperinflation archetype, a whirlwind that sucked in everything. Building on those strikes and putsch attempts, the Reichsbank cranked the presses to 500 quintillion marks daily by November. A dollar? 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled in days. Workers hauled wages in wheelbarrows, racing to spend before dusk halved their worth. Savings? A cruel joke. A life's toil couldn't claim a crust. Yet in this maelstrom, debts vanished. Mortgages, loans, bonds, all erased as repayments came in phantom currency. Creditors, savers, the bourgeois heart of Germany, annihilated. The middle class, that engine of stability, lay in ruins. Then in December, salvation's pivot. The rent mark, pegged to land and factories, one new unit swapping for $1 trillion old. The old money, demonetized, slate wiped, total erasure through currency Armageddon. I've pored over the archives. The survivor's eyes still burn with that hollow fire. And in 2025, with our own dollars dancing on digital strings, how far are we from wheelbarrows of Bitcoin? Post-World War II, Europe offers a rare glint of negotiated grace, but even that drips with tension. From 1945 to 1953, West Germany stared down a debt colossus, over 30 billion marks in reparations, loans, and ghosts of the Reich, eclipsing its shattered GDP. Bombs had leveled cities, but finances threatened to bury the resurrection. The Allies, with America's muscle at the helm, gathered in London's shadowed conference rooms for the 1953 debt agreement. Suspense hung thick, haggling over haircuts. They slashed 50% off the burden, easing terms on the rest. It wasn't charity, it was cold calculus. Revived Germany to counter the Iron Curtain's chill. Debts thawed, the Wirtschaftswunder ignited, rockets and exports soared. A negotiated jubilee, method 2. Compromise averts the abyss, but probe deeper, and you see the fragility. Without U.S. largesse, would it have been hyperinflation or worse? So why does this matter now in the electric tension of 2025? Our world's debt mountain, $300 trillion and climbing, dwarfs Rome's or Weimar's in scale, laced with student chains, climate reparations, and AI-fueled bubbles. Left and right unite in fury. Central banks juggle rates like live grenades, and geopolitics simmers toward flashpoints. The mechanisms I've unveiled aren't relics. They're blueprints. If we hit stage 6, be it Fed-fueled inflation eroding your retirement, a cyber plague gutting enforcers, or conflicts redrawing maps, creditors fall, wealth shifts violently, and rebuilds favor the cunning. Savers? Collateral damage. The system resets, often unequally, birthing new powers from the old world's grave. As I close this investigation, reflect with me. History isn't a cycle. It's a siren, wailing for attention. In 2025, we're not spectators. We're the players. Will we heed the warnings, forge preemptive paths like London's deal, or tumble into destruction's embrace? The choice pulses in every policy tweet, every market tick. Tune in, stay vigilant. The financial storm gathers, and only the prepared will navigate the reset. What hidden lever will you pull? The credits roll, but the story. It's just beginning. Imagine this. It's 2025, and the global economy teeters on the brink of a silent storm. Trillions in debt, stacked like invisible mountains, threaten to bury nations, from the gleaming skyscrapers of New York to the bustling markets of Beijing. But what if I told you this isn't chaos? It's a pattern, etched in history's bloodiest pages. A reset is coming, one that could wipe out your savings overnight, and the clues have been hiding in plain sight for decades. Buckle up. I'm about to pull back the curtain on how empires rise, crumble, and reinvent themselves through the alchemy of debt. Let's start at the end of World War II, a time when the world was picking up the pieces of devastation. Germany, crushed under the weight of reparations from the previous war, faced a debt bomb estimated at over 30 billion marks, more than its entire economy could produce. The Allies, spearheaded by a rising United States, knew better than to repeat the mistakes of Versailles. In 1953, they gathered in London for a pivotal conference, not out of charity but cold calculation. They slashed Germany's obligations by half, forgiving billions outright. The rest? Repaid on terms so generous they were practically a gift, low interest, stretched over decades and linked to Germany's export strength. France, the UK, and America absorbed the hits, writing off fortunes to let the miracle of the German economic boom take root. This wasn't just forgiveness, it was a deliberate jubilee, a biblical reset button pressed by modern powers. Why go to such lengths? The scars of the 1920s were fresh. Crushing debts had fueled hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, birthing extremism and paving the road to Hitler. The London Agreement was engineered as a firewall against that nightmare, ensuring debts were manageable, growth was possible, and stability returned. Creditor nations swallowed losses because they understood. A chained economy breeds monsters. This is our first lesson in the art of financial resurrection. Negotiated relief, where the powerful concede ground to avert catastrophe. But history doesn't whisper. It roars patterns for those who listen. I've spent years tracing these cycles, mapping ancient collapses to our hyper-connected world of 2025. Debt isn't just numbers on a ledger, it's a force that reshapes societies. And right now, we're hurtling through a six-stage gauntlet that's played out before, from ancient Rome to post-war Europe. The question burning in boardrooms and basements alike: which escape hatch will we take when the walls close in? Stage 1 sets the trap with seductive ease. It's the era of illusionary abundance where credit flows like cheap wine at a feast. Flashback to the late 20th century. From 1980 through 2008, what economists dubbed the quote, _9___ masked a borrowing binge. Households loaded up on credit cards and mortgages, students drowned in loans for degrees promising the American dream, corporations leveraged buyouts to swell profits, and governments, oh, the governments, piled on sovereign debt to fund endless ambitions. The U.S. economy swelled, living standards climbed, and it felt like we'd cracked the code to perpetual growth. But peel back the gloss and it was all leverage. A house of cards built on borrowed time. Prosperity? Sure, for a season. In 2025, looking back, we see it for what it was: the calm before the credit storm. By stage 2, the illusion cracks, but instead of mending, we double down. Debts balloon to unsustainable heights, over 250% of global GDP by the late 2000s. The 2008 financial crisis hit like a thunderclap, exposing the rot. Banks teetering, homes foreclosed, jobs vaporized. Yet rather than slashing the excess through painful deleveraging, policymakers hit the accelerator. Central banks flooded the system with liquidity. Governments borrowed trillions more to bail out the system. Fast forward to 2020. Pandemic panic pushed global debt to 320% of GDP, and by now, in 2025, it's cresting 350%. The U.S. alone stares down $36 trillion in federal debt, plus over $100 trillion in looming liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. It's not growth. It's a global game of hot potato, with debts passed from generation to generation, nation to nation. Now we enter the danger zone, stage 3, where the math turns vicious. Interest payments devour every scrap of economic progress. In the U.S., those costs are barreling toward $1 trillion a year, a black hole sucking in tax dollars that could rebuild infrastructure or fund schools. Globally, on $300 trillion in total debt, at even a modest 3% average rate, we're forking over $9 trillion annually in interest, while the world's GDP inches forward by just $2.7 trillion. Do the arithmetic. It's a deficit that can't be bridged without sacrifice. We've been here since 2020, when low rates masked the bleed, but rising yields in 2025 have ripped the bandage off. Governments borrow to pay interest on past borrowing, a Ponzi scheme on a planetary scale. The suspense builds. How long before the engine sputters? Stage 4 arrives like an unwelcome verdict, inescapable recognition that the debts are mathematically unpayable. By 2023, calculators in think tanks and trading floors lit up with the truth. $36 trillion federal, 320% of U.S. GDP when you tally the unfunded promises. Globally, it's 335% and climbing. No amount of growth or austerity closes the gap without a miracle or a rupture. Investors whisper it in Davos corridors. Politicians dodge it in election cycles. But denial has an expiration date, and in 2025 it's stamped overdue. That's when Stage 5 ignites, the pressure cooker of politics. From 2020 onward, the calls have grown louder, demands for a reckoning. Student loan forgiveness wipes $1.7 trillion off young shoulders, a taste of jubilee. Wealth taxes bubble up in progressive manifestos. Modern monetary theory gurus argue debt is a myth, just print more. Crypto rebels decry fiat's fragility. Gold hoarders predict the fall, and both U.S. parties peddle spending sprees without a whisper of repayment. Globally, cries echo from debt-trapped nations in Africa and Latin America, eyeing $300 billion owed to China. The air crackles with unrest, protests, policy pivots, populist surges. In 2025, this isn't background noise, it's the groundswell demanding reset. And Stage 6? The climax we've all feared. The grand reset. History pegs it at 3 to 7 years after Stage 3 hits, and we're 3 years in. That window, 2023 to 2027, looms like a shadow over today's markets. Based on the playbook, 3 paths emerge, each more harrowing than the last. The frontrunner. Method 1, hyperinflation slow burn. Not the wheelbarrow chaos of Weimar, but a stealthy erosion. 10 to 20% annual inflation grinding for a decade. Governments repay the $36 trillion with dollars devalued by half or more, preserving the illusion of solvency. Creditors watch their claims evaporate in real terms. Savers see nests gutted. We've glimpsed it already. 2021 supply shock spiked prices to 7 to 9%, but adjust for honest metrics, and it was double digits. In 2025, with supply chains frayed and energy wars raging, this fire smolders hotter. It's the path of least resistance. No messy defaults, just a gradual theft from the future. Method 2 offers a cleaner break, the negotiated jubilee echoing London's grace. Half the burden forgiven, the rest restructured on life support terms. In the U.S., political gridlock makes it a long shot, but cracks appear. Student relief is the appetizer. Expand to mortgages or credit cards, and it's a feast. Globally, talks swirl around forgiving poor nations' loads to China, though Beijing's grip tightens. Coordinated defaults could mimic it, forcing creditors to the table. It's renewal through concession, but it demands unity we rarely muster. Then there's Method 3, the abyss. War as the ultimate eraser. A conflagration, U.S. versus China and Russia, obliterating assets, thinning creditor ranks, rendering debts moot amid the rubble. World War II did just that for Europe, resetting ledgers in fire. In 2025, with Taiwan tensions and Ukraine's shadow, the specter haunts. History's ledger is grim. When debts deadlock politics, battlefields decide. Pray we swerve. The truth will likely blend them. A toxic cocktail of creeping inflation laced with piecemeal jubilees and brushfire conflicts. No single apocalypse, but a decade of erosion from 2025 onward. Debts dissolving in a haze of 15% price surges, selective write-offs, and proxy wars that scar supply lines. Markets will lurch, Currencies wobble, but the system endures, remade, unequal. Why does this matter now, in the heart of 2025? Because you're not watching from the sidelines, you're in the crosshairs. When the reset hits, it strikes ordinary lives hardest in three brutal strokes. First, your safeguards shatter. Cash in the bank? Inflation halves its bite. $100,000 today buys what $50,000 will tomorrow. Bonds and treasuries? They yield crumbs while prices soar. A 4% return against 15% decay means you're hemorrhaging 11% yearly. Savers, the prudent backbone of society, get torched. Second, the vulnerable get crushed. Retirees on fixed pensions, Social Security checks, or annuities watch streams dwindle in real power. That $3,000 monthly lifeline. It stretches half as far amid rising rents and groceries. Generations who played by the rules find security slipping away, forcing tough choices between medicine and meals. Third, and this is the gut punch, it widens the chasm. The elite, with assets in stocks, real estate, or hedges like gold and crypto, weather the storm or thrive. But the middle, wages lag, debts compound, opportunities vanish. The reset doesn't level the field. It tilts it further, breeding resentment that history knows all too well. As I stand here in 2025 peering into this gathering tempest, one truth echoes from the ages. Debt's cycle is inexorable, but awareness is our shield. The London saviors acted wisely once. Will we? The reset looms, not as distant thunder, but as the ground shifting beneath us. Heed the patterns, protect what you can, and remember, in the grand ledger of empires, the prepared don't just survive, they redefine the game. The storm is here. What will you build in its wake? Imagine this. You're a lender, a saver, someone who's trusted the system to protect your nest egg. You've poured your hard-earned money into bonds, money market funds, or even just a simple "I owe you" from a friend. But in the shadows of 2025's global economy, inflation isn't just creeping. It's a silent thief, rewriting the rules of repayment. What if that debt you hold comes back to you in dollars that buy half as much as before? Not because of fraud, but because the very currency we all rely on is being eroded from within. This isn't a conspiracy. It's the next chapter in a 2,000-year pattern of financial resets that's about to unfold right before our eyes. Buckle up. I'm about to reveal how the winners and losers of this inevitable shift are already being decided, and what you can do to make sure you're not left holding the bag. Let's start by peeling back the layers on this brutal truth about creditors. Picture yourself as one of those everyday investors, perhaps a retiree who's shifted savings into what were once quote 12 treasuries or corporate bonds. You've lent out your money expecting steady returns, a promise of stability in an uncertain world. But as inflation surges, think 10, 15% or more in the coming years, those repayments hit you like a gut punch. The principal comes back, sure, a full 100 cents on the dollar. But each of those cents? They're diluted, worthless against skyrocketing prices for groceries, fuel, and housing. It's like getting paid in confetti at a party that's already over. In real terms, your wealth evaporates not through theft, but through the quiet mechanics of a currency debasement that's as old as empires. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Dive deeper, and you'll uncover the hidden machinery at work here. The great imbalance between those who owe and those who are owed. While creditors watch their fortunes fade, debtors, anyone with fixed-rate loans like mortgages or business debt, suddenly find themselves on the winning side. I remember crunching the numbers on this during late nights poring over economic histories. It's almost poetic in its injustice. Take a typical 30-year mortgage for $300,000 at today's rates. Your monthly payments stay locked in, unchanging. But as inflation accelerates, your income rises to match the new reality. Wages, if you're in a productive field, often chase the price spiral. By the end of those 3 decades, that $300,000 principal, it's eroded to the equivalent of $150,000 in today's purchasing power. You've effectively borrowed at a discount, a 50% haircut gifted by the inflating dollar. It's not cheating the system, it's riding the wave that the system itself creates. And it's not just debtors who come out ahead. The real victors? Owners of hard assets, things with intrinsic value that no currency fluctuation can erase. Real estate, for instance. A home isn't just bricks and mortar. It's shelter, it's rental income, it's a hedge against the storm. Whether priced in dollars, euros, or whatever comes next, its worth endures because it's useful, tangible. Commodities like gold and silver, they've been the quiet sentinels through every collapse, from ancient coinages to modern markets. Agricultural land, productive factories, businesses that churn out real goods. These aren't paper promises, they're the backbone of survival. I've seen it play out in simulations and real-world case studies. When currencies reset, these assets don't just hold value, they multiply for those who hold them. But here's where the suspense builds. What if I told you this isn't random chaos, but a predictable cycle etched into the annals of history? Let's journey back, not to dusty textbooks, but to the raw drama of civilizations on the brink. 5 times in 2,000 years, when debts ballooned beyond what societies could bear, the reset came like clockwork. In ancient Rome, emperors bailed out the masses by debasing silver coins, turning debts into dust while the elite hoarded land and grain. Fast forward to medieval Europe. The Black Death wiped out half the population, slashing labor costs and erasing feudal obligations in a grim jubilee. Revolutionary France? They fired up the printing presses, churning out assignats until they were as valuable as wallpaper, hyper-inflating away noble estates. Weimar Germany in the 1920s took it to extremes. 1 wheelbarrow of marks for a loaf of bread, debts vaporized in months. And after World War II, Europe negotiated a sweeping 50% debt forgiveness, rebuilding on the ashes of old ledgers. Each era, different villains, the same script, 6 stages from euphoric credit booms to total erasure. Stage 1, the party starts with easy money. Stage 2, debts pile up. We hit Stage 3 around 2020, pandemic stimulus flooding the world. Now in 2025, we're sliding into Stage 4, stagnation, with interest payments devouring economic growth like a black hole. Stage 5 brings the desperation in 6, the reset, inflation, default, or worse. The method changes, but the math doesn't. When global debt hits 335% of GDP, as it has now with $300 trillion outstanding, repayment isn't an option. It's mathematical fiction. Interest alone is choking progress, the system's on life support, and the plug's about to be pulled. Why does this matter right now in the fragile calm of 2025? Because the indicators are flashing red, and history whispers that these cycles don't dawdle. They accelerate as they near the end. We're not talking a leisurely decade. Patterns from Rome to Weimar show 3 to 7 years from Stage 3 to the cliff. That puts us staring down 2025 to 2027, maybe sooner if tensions flare. Geopolitical rifts, supply shocks, or just the sheer weight of it all. Track the signs yourself. Bond yield spiking, Watch if the 10-year Treasury climbs past 6 or 7%, as creditors finally demand protection from the inflation beast. Or dive into real inflation metrics from sources like Shadow Stats, which strip away the official spin to show the true erosion. We're not in uncharted waters. We're retracing a map that's been drawn 5 times before. So how do you position for this? If you're listening closely, you're already ahead. First, slash your cash exposure. Don't let idle money in savings or money markets rot away. Keep just 3 to 6 months' worth for emergencies. The rest is inflation bait. Second, pivot to hard assets that thrive in resets. Income-generating real estate like rental properties in growing areas, physical commodities such as gold, silver, or farmland, and businesses that produce essentials, generating cash flow no matter the currency. These aren't gambles, they're lifelines holding value through the storm. Third, and this one's bound to raise eyebrows, embrace strategic debt. In a world barreling toward 10 to 15% inflation, a fixed-rate 30-year mortgage at 6% isn't a burden, it's a superpower. Borrow to acquire appreciating assets and watch the real cost melt away as your income swells. I've run the scenarios. It's like the bank handed you a time machine to shrink tomorrow's obligations. Fourth, stay vigilant. Monitor those yields, inflation trackers, and debt-to-GDP ratios. When creditors panic and dump bonds, that's your signal. Stage 6 is knocking. And fifth, act early. History's clear. The pattern speeds up at the end. Don't wait for the headlines. Position now before the rush. As we stand here in 2025 with the global economy teetering on this familiar precipice, the reset isn't a quote 14, it's a when. Debts won't be honored. They'll be dissolved in inflation's fire, a jubilee masked as policy, or the chaos of conflict. Wealth will flow from the cautious savers clutching cash and bonds to the bold debtors and asset holders who saw the math. 5 empires rose and fell to this rhythm, and ours is dancing to the same beat. Stages 4, 5, and 6 loom with the certainty of nightfall. If this glimpse into the pattern has shifted how you view your portfolio, your debts, your future, good. You're awakening to what's coming. The survivors of history weren't the lucky ones. They were the prepared. In a world hurtling toward reset, will you be the creditor left penniless or the one who thrives? The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking.